Under the dimmed glow of cabin lights, when the flight attendants were still urging passengers to find their seats, the injustice struck like a slap against silence. A man in business attire, red-faced from impatience, leaned over row 13 and scoffed loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Figures they'd let anyone sit here these days," he sneered, eyes fixed on the woman in seat 13F. His words carried the cutting tone of someone certain no one would challenge him. Around him, the silence of strangers became a shield of complicity, passengers sinking into their headrests, unwilling to intervene. She did not flinch. Her hands rested lightly on the armrest, fingers curled as if holding on to something long gone, her gaze steady on the oval window beside her. She was not dressed in a uniform, not adorned with ribbons or medals that explained the quiet storm in her eyes, only a plain jacket and a name patch sewn faintly at the cuff. A name that no one on board recognized, and yet it was a name that had once been spoken in briefing rooms, whispered in code across radio channels, and etched into mission reports that never saw the light of public knowledge. The man beside her continued his muttering, dismissive, dripping with mock authority, and still she did not move. Her silence was sharper than words, her restraint a blade of its own. The passengers saw only a woman in an airline seat, but the truth was far heavier. Years ago, in a cockpit miles above any sea, she had learned that silence could mean survival. She had been the calm in a storm of missiles, the unshakable voice when men twice her size had faltered. The hum of the aircraft's engines now carried her back to that past, where jet fuel stung the air, sweat clung beneath her helmet, and the taste of metal and adrenaline never truly left her tongue. She had flown missions where the ground never saw her shadow, where her call sign became the only thing standing between chaos and order. But war leaves marks that do not fade with medals. Her comrades' names remained etched in her memory more deeply than any engraving. She remembered the night sky over the desert, the acrid smoke of flares, and the silence that followed after radio static told her that 2 jets would not be coming home. Their faces never blurred with time. They lived in her like ghosts, seated beside her on every commercial flight she ever took. That was why she chose window seats, so the empty space at her side could remain theirs. And now, here in 13F, a stranger's disdain tried to belittle something he could never comprehend. The injustice simmered, unspoken, in the pressurized air of the cabin. A soldier seated 2 rows ahead shifted uneasily, recognizing the weight in her posture, though he said nothing. The flight attendants, bound by their duty to keep the peace, pretended not to hear, their eyes flicking nervously past the confrontation. Around her, passengers buried themselves in glowing screens, in plastic cups of soda, in anything that would spare them the discomfort of defending her dignity. Yet her silence held. She did not need their defense. The man leaned closer, emboldened by her lack of response, by the cowardice of those around them. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice just low enough to avoid drawing an official reprimand, yet sharp enough to cut. She turned her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes at last. In that moment, her silence spoke louder than fury. Her look was not defiance but recognition, the kind one gives to someone so unaware of their smallness. The engines roared to life, but her heart heard something else. A frequency only she would recognize, the memory of a crackling radio line from years past. "Call sign, Valkyrie, status check." The words were etched in her bones. She had been Valkyrie once. She had been the unseen guardian of pilots who trusted her voice in the darkest hours. And now, here, among strangers, her call sign still lingered like an ember waiting to ignite. The flight rose into the night, the city shrinking beneath, stars opening above like the canopy she once called home. And then it came. A ripple of turbulence jolted the aircraft, and overhead compartments rattled. Passengers stiffened, whispers rose, but her expression never changed. She leaned slightly against the window, as if listening for something beyond the engines. It was then, faint but unmistakable, that two fighter jets streaked parallel to the airliner, their silhouettes visible in the pale moonlight. Gasps spread through the cabin as passengers pressed their faces to the windows, confusion rippling through rows. But she knew the shape of those wings, the disciplined movement. F-22 Raptors, guardians of the sky. And as one tilted its wing in acknowledgement, her breath caught. On the secure channels that passengers would never hear, her name had been spoken. Valkyrie. Not her legal name, not the one sewn quietly on her cuff, but the call sign reserved only for skies, only for missions that history would never fully tell. The pilots outside had heard she was aboard. The man who had mocked her earlier shrank into his seat, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of something he could not dismiss. He had scoffed at a passenger, but now two war machines saluted her presence in absolute silence, their gesture more thunderous than any reprimand. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze forward, watching the jets glide like shadows of her past, like comrades who never stopped flying beside her. Around her, passengers no longer avoided their shame. They stared, hushed, reverent, realizing they had been seated beside someone who carried more than they could fathom. She had no need to explain, no need to reveal medals or scars. Her silence was her shield, her memory her honor. And when one of the jets broke formation for a moment, dipping its nose ever so slightly toward her window before returning to its post, she allowed herself the faintest smile. "You don't belong here," the man had said, but now the truth stood undeniable in the night sky. She belonged everywhere sacrifice had left its mark. She belonged in every flight that crossed these skies because freedom had been written by voices like hers, call signs like Valkyrie. She whispered words that no one else could hear, a promise carried only in her heart. Some debts are paid not in medals or applause, but in silence and memory. The passengers remained hushed until the jets disappeared into the horizon, but the silence they left behind was not the silence of cowardice. It was reverence, the kind that could never be commanded, only earned. The man in business attire kept his head low, unable to meet her gaze, and she returned to her window seat, hands resting as they had before, serene as though nothing had shifted. Yet everything had. Sometimes the loudest victories are not parades or applause, but the unshakable dignity of one who needs no defense. Sometimes the strongest line is the one that is never shouted, but carried in silence, steady as steel. And in that moment, every soul aboard understood that some heroes do not ask for recognition. They simply endure, and the world eventually cannot help but recognize them. For those who had watched silently, perhaps ashamed of their inaction, this flight would never be forgotten. For the man who had spoken with cruelty, it was a lesson written across the stars. And for her, it was another night where ghosts of the past kept her company. Another night where honor needed no words. Respect is not always demanded. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on the wings of those who know your name, even when you thought the world had forgotten it. She had been only a passenger in 13F, but when the Raptors dipped their wings, the truth became undeniable. She was Valkyrie,